When I was younger, we would make this annual trip from Nashville, Tennessee to Houston, Texas, usually once a year to see my dad's side of the family. And back in the dark ages, those of you who are my age or older will remember that the speed limit on interstates was only 55 miles an hour. And so making that trip was not the 10-hour trip it was today. It was a 16 or 17-hour trip. And coming from Nashville, getting to Texarkana was only the halfway point. And so when we saw Welcome to Texas, we knew we were only halfway there. It was an incredibly long trip. And like so many kids, at some point in the trip, I inevitably asked that age-old question. Are we there yet? I'm hungry. I'm tired. How much longer? Fill in the blank. If you are a parent with kids, you know all the questions that kids like to ask. It didn't matter what was in the back seat, Christmas presents, Easter presents. It didn't matter what was in the trunk. It didn't matter how much food was in the cooler that was stuck between me and my other sister. Emily was not born yet. I was never satisfied. I was always complaining because I always wanted something more. I wanted to stop at Wendy's because that was the epitome of culinary cuisine when you're an 8-year-old boy. It was never enough. And so I was always complaining. It didn't matter what food, what was available, I always complained. And that's kind of what we see there in Israel, there in Numbers chapter 11. There in Numbers chapter 11, Israel is on a bit of a road trip. A road trip through the wilderness. And despite the fact that God had given them everything they need, they're always finding another reason to complain. And don't we do the exact same thing today? That even though we are here tonight and we are surrounded by so many blessings, you and I, we have this tendency to complain. We don't understand why everything bad always seems to happen to me. Why the person on the other side of the fence always seems to have everything go right in their life. We don't always understand why life has to be so difficult for us. We are never satisfied with what we have. We always want just a little bit more. I think back to a moment in our adult Bible class, almost a year ago it was, and we were talking about the size of a boat. And one of the men spoke up and said, yeah, my boat is 19 feet long, and without a dime, one of the other men says, well, my boat's 19 and a half. We always want the 19-and-a-half-foot boat. And once we have the 19-and-a-half-foot boat, guess what we want? We want the 20-foot boat. We are never satisfied. We are always complaining. We complain because we forget what God has done for us in the past. We complain because we overlook what God is doing for us even right now in our lives, in the very present. We complain because we ignore what God has provided for us in the future. When what we really need to be doing in our lives and in our hearts is thinking about how immensely blessed we are. That when we really think about it and we look at our blessings and look at our lives, our garbage disposal probably eats better than 30% of the world's population. That's how blessed we are in this country. We are incredibly blessed. And yet we complain perhaps the most. And I don't know about you, but I struggle with complaining. I don't always have that positive, grateful attitude I should have. And that attitude has a tendency of spreading. That negative Nancy, Debbie, Downer attitude spreads and it affects my family, it affects my friends, and maybe it's affected you in some form or fashion. That complaining heart has a tendency to pass on to the next person. And so tonight what I want us to do is just to look at the idea of a complaining heart, looking at really at three lessons we can learn from Israel there in Numbers chapter 11 through 14. And along the way, I really want us to examine our hearts and examine our lives to see if there is just a little too much Israel in us, to see if we may have that complaining heart. And when we look at Numbers 11, and we study and we open our eyes to what that text is trying to teach us, I think we'll find out one thing: that complaining hearts forget the blessings of God. That's what I think the overriding lesson, the one big thing, the big principle that we can take away from this text tonight is that complaining hearts forget the blessings of God. Here in Numbers chapter 11, at this point in Numbers, the children of Israel have been free for about 13 months. So 14 months ago, for them, they were making bricks in Egypt. 14 months ago, they were slaves. 14 months ago, they had a boss, and his name was Pharaoh. But now they are free. And that freedom wasn't good enough. They wanted more. And so now they're in Numbers chapter 11 and verse 1. The people began complaining openly before the Lord about hardship. And when the Lord heard, his anger burned, and fire from the Lord blazed among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the place was named Taberah, because the Lord's fire had blazed among them. There in the text, they're complaining openly before the Lord. When I see what they're doing here in the text, the thought that comes to my mind is not like they're going, well, this is a rough day. It's been a long 13 months in the wilderness. We're kind of tired of living in tents. We're ready for that city. This is something they're complaining very openly before their people. It's not just blowing off some steam. And yet, when we look at Israel's history in the wilderness, they always seem to be complaining about something. We don't like this food. We're tired. We're thirsty. And why is Israel always complaining there in the wilderness? Well, they're always complaining because they continue to forget God's goodness in the past. And really, that's the first reason we complain too. Again, keep in mind where they were 14 months earlier. They were slaves. They were in Exodus chapter 1, 2, and 3. They were crying out to the Lord, Lord, help us. Remember your promises to us. And God heard their cry, and he rescued them. And now that he's rescued them, that wasn't good enough. And so they are complaining openly before the Lord. They have forgotten that without God's goodness, without God's love, without God's grace, without God's mercy, they would still be slaves in Egypt. And so they complain. And sometimes we do the exact same thing. That we forget about God's grace and God's mercy and God's love in our own life, and that leads us to complain. And when we really think about it, at the root of all of our complaining is the simple fact that we complain because we believe we deserve better than we have received. We complain because we want that bigger boat, the 19.5-foot boat. We complain because we want the bigger house. We complain because we want the bigger, nicer car. We complain because we feel entitled. And in a lot of ways, we love to pick on the younger generation for being so entitled. But guys, entitlement is not just a problem that millennials like myself struggle with. It's not something that Generation Z, that's the generation after millennials, struggle with. Entitlement is a human problem. We all struggle with feelings of entitlement in our life. And do you know how I know that? Look at Numbers chapter 11. They have an entitlement problem in Numbers chapter 11. And to the best of my knowledge, there are no millennials present in Numbers chapter 11. If there are millennials present in Numbers chapter 11, they're 3,000 years old today, and so they're going to be really old millennials. Guys, not much has changed in the world since number 11. We still have a problem with remembering God's goodness in our life. And so what's the solution? What can we do in our life? How can we remember God's goodness so we don't forget it? Well, the thing we can do is keep our eyes on the cross. I think that's one of the best things that we can do each and every Sunday morning. Not only is it commanded for us to remember his death, but there's a reason for it. That every Sunday when we gather around the Lord's table to remember the death of our Savior, we are weekly reminded of his goodness and how God has shown his grace and his mercy and his love to us. Jesus died to save us. We need to remember that. We can't forget that. But at the same time, I think it's also helpful for us to remember God's goodness in our physical lives. To look around at our lives and all the blessings that we have. The cars and the houses and the boats. And whatever the physical blessings that we may have, and to thank God for them. So that even in the moments when times get tough, just stop. Slow down and remember all the ways that God has been good to us, even today in our lives. You know, if there's one thing that complaining does, is it kills our joy in our life. It prevents us from enjoying those good things in our life. Have you ever been used car shopping? Some of y'all know Allison and I got to enjoy that experience recently. And you're going car shopping and you call ahead and you look online or whatever and you show up at the dealership and you're looking at the one specific vehicle. Like that one vehicle on the lot that's in your price range. And the sales guy never brings out that vehicle. What's he do? He goes and finds the one with all the bells and whistles. The one with like the leather seats and the heated seats, like every seat is heated. And all the bells and whistles, he's having to Google what the bells and whistles do so he can sell them on you. And you spend so much time looking at this nice car with all these nice things that you really don't need, and you start to fall in love with it. You start going, man, I really wish I could have this car. It would be so nice to have this bell or have this whistle. And you forget the reason you came. For the car that was in your price range. For the car that was in your budget. For the car that you really, really need. In some ways, that's what's going on there with Israel. They get so focused on what they can't have and what they don't have, they forget the reason why they're there. They forget why they came. They forget what God has done for them. They start to overlook God's provision for them in the present. That's the second reason we complain today. In fact, that's exactly what Israel does beginning in verses 4 through 6. In verses 4 through 6, the text says, the riffraff among them had a strong craving for other food. And the Israelites wept again and said, who will feed us meat? Honestly, I can't blame them. I like a good piece of meat. And they start to remember verse 5, the free fish. That's interesting. Free fish, what was their job in Egypt? Slaves. They worked for that quote-unquote free fish. We ate in Egypt along with the cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing to look at but this manna. They're tired of it. They're tired of this manna. So they whine and so they complain. They start to look back at Egypt and go, oh, remember those good old days? Back when we had melons and cucumbers and fruits and vegetables and everything was fresh right off the vine, and the free, quote unquote, fresh fish that we used to eat. That's what they're doing there in the text. They forgot that they were slaves. And really deep down, that's what complaining does. Complaining leads us to forget and to overlook how God is providing for us in the present. Complaining convinces us that what God has given us isn't good enough. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Things were always better back in the good old days. We're always convinced that happiness is right around the corner, to the point where we begin to forget all the ways that God has blessed us. You know, that's kind of what Eve does there in the garden. There in the garden, Eve is surrounded by every fruit and every vegetable and everything she would ever want and everything she ever could dream of. She is walking with God, has fellowship with God, and she starts to compare what she can have with what she can't have. She starts to overlook God's provision for her in the present, and she forgets everything that God has provided for her. And that's what we do too. That we start to compare, why don't I have that bigger house? Why don't I have that bigger car? Why can't I have this or that in my life? And we forget all the ways that God has provided for us. But that's what comparison does. When we overlook God's provision for us in the present, we start to compare what we have with what we don't have. Comparison gives us a reason to complain. It gives us a reason to go to God and go, God, why can't I have this fruit? God, why can't I have this car? Why don't I have meat? Why won't God give me this? Get really jealous. And when we say things like that, we show that we really just have a complaining heart. A heart that is so obsessed with comparing and complaining that we forget how God is blessing us right here, right now, in the present. That we have a home to go home to. We have food in our fridge. We have a car that we can drive. We have clothes that we can wear. We have family and friends to love on us and to love. We have relationships. We have so much to be thankful for. But so often in our lives, we overlook God's provision for us in the present. And one of the best things we can do if we want to be a joyful people, after all, that's our focus for this month, is remember all the ways that God has blessed us in the present. You know, we sometimes sing this song, count your blessings, name them one by one. I mean, have you ever stopped to do that? Like maybe when you get home, pull out a blank sheet of paper and just start writing some of your blessings down. And if we do that, if we've ever done that, you begin to realize, man, I'm really immensely blessed. You know, a lot of times we start talking about a Christmas list, and my in-laws will come to me every Thanksgiving and go, what's on your Christmas list? But what we really need to be doing is asking for a thank you list. Writing down all the things that we can be thankful for so we don't overlook God's provision for us in the present. But that is a real struggle for all of us. And it was a real struggle for Israel too. And yet when I look at Israel there in the wilderness, I think one of the reasons they struggled so much is they forgot their problems were just temporary. That God had promised them there in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 8 to bring them to a land that was flowing with milk and honey. And that everything they're going through on that trip to the promised land was really just a journey to enjoy before they enjoyed God's blessings. In fact, when we get over to Numbers chapter 13, that trip to Canaan has taken a little longer than they probably expected when they left Egypt. Has that ever happened to you? You're on a journey and it goes a little bit longer than you expected. Maybe you're taking a 2 or 3 hour trip down to the coast or 2 or 3 hour trip down to Houston and you hit some traffic and suddenly a 2 or 3 hour trip becomes like a 4 or 5 hour trip. And you're sitting there going, I just want to be there. I'm tired of being in the car. You start to get a little whiny, a little cranky because you hit traffic. That's what's going on with Israel there. They're stuck in the middle of nowhere. They are tired. They are thirsty. They just want to be in the promised land. Somewhere along the way, they forgot that God had a better plan for them. And that's really the third reason we complain. That we complain because we ignore God's promises for the future. And whoever has a clicker, click it. There we go. It went. You know, if we go 2 chapters over to Numbers chapter 13, there in verse 27, they've sent some spies into the land, and those spies come back to the people of Israel, and there in verse 27, they come back and tell Israel, indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit. In other words, God was right. God told us, God promised that he was going to take us to a land flowing with milk and honey, and now here we are 14 months later, and we're there. It is flowing with milk and honey. God was faithful to his promises. But then in verse 28, however, the people living in the land are strong. The cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev, and the Hethites and the Jebusites and the Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. And there in verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him responded, we can't attack the people because they are stronger than we are. In other words, these spies, those 10 spies, come back and tell the people, yes, God was right. God was promised us a land flowing with milk and honey. Yes, it is a land flowing with milk and honey, but guess what? We can't take it. We can't defeat them. And they're right. On their own, those 10 spies realized that they could not defeat the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Hethites and the Jebusites. They knew it. Those nations had walled cities. Those nations had standing armies. There was no way Israel could defeat them on their own. But they forgot about God. And they forgot about God's power and God's providence. Their real problem here in Numbers chapter 13, however, was a lack of faith. And their lack of faith clouded their vision. It prevented them from seeing that God was on their side. It prevented them from seeing that God had been faithful to his promises in the past. It prevented them from seeing that God was faithful and redeemed them from Egypt and killed the Egyptian army, had delivered them time and time and time again. And now they begin to ignore God's promise for the future. There in chapter 14 and verse 2, they complain again. That all the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron. And the whole community told them, if only we had died in the wilderness, or in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and our children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? There in Numbers chapter 14, the children of Israel got so caught up in the here and now that they ignored God's promise for the future. And yet we look at Israel here in Numbers 14. And we go, how could they? They saw the Red Sea divide. They saw the plagues. They saw all the wonders God had worked over and over and over again in the wilderness in the last 13 to 14 months. How could they forget everything that God has done? Why would they turn their backs on God? Well, they turned their backs on God because they forgot that God had been faithful to his promises in the past. And that led them to ignore God's promises for the future. And yet, if we look at our lives today and we examine our hearts today, how often do we do exact same thing? That we know God has promised us heaven, but instead we choose to pursue the passing pleasures of sin. Sometimes we get caught up in the here and now that we forget about heaven. How often do we make that choice in our life? How often in our life do we exchange the promise of heaven for something that is absolutely worthless? If we're honest with ourselves, we'll probably do that more times than we would like to admit. And why do we do that? Why do we change the promise of heaven for something that is worthless? We do that because we ignore God's promise. We do that because we want something right here, right now, and we can't see past it. We begin to forget that there is nothing that can compare to the glory that is about to be revealed. That's why we sin. Instead, we need to have the attitude that Paul had there in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 7. As Paul contemplates his life and how he's lived, he looks back at his previous life in Judaism, and there, beginning in verse 7 of Philippians chapter 3, he says, "But everything that was gain to me, all my education as a Jewish rabbi, all my training, all my time, all my energy, everything I exerted to be a leading Jew, all those things that would have been a gain to me, I consider to be a loss for Christ. More than that, I also consider everything to be a loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. Because of him, I have suffered the loss of all things and consider them as dung so that I may gain Christ." Paul did not ignore God's promise of the future. Paul's focus, Paul's desire, Paul's goal was on Christ. And so what is Paul trying to teach us? What is Numbers 14 teaching us? It's teaching us that there is nothing more important than heaven. And this means that the habits we make today, the life we live today, must be focused on eternity. Can we say that about our life? Can we say that the way I live today, the habits I have in my life today, are focused on my goal of heaven? Maybe you're here tonight and you have had a complaining heart, that your focus has not been on the future, on your goal of heaven, but it's been elsewhere. You've ignored what God has done in the past. You've overlooked what he's doing at present, and you've forgotten about the future, but you're ready to change. You're ready to change because you realize that you have a complaining heart, and a complaining heart overlooks God's blessings. If you're ready to make that change, you're ready to resolve to make that change, please let us know while together we stand and sing.